The sixth instruction. The following instruction is an instruction that may sound strange to some people. This is because there are people who are used to eating fresh foods. What's fresher than a living creature? This instruction forbids people who are considered Noah's sons and hence they are considered righteous in God's eyes and therefore have a significant relationship with God, to eat a part of the animal while the animal is still alive. What does an organ of an animal that is still alive mean? In fact, the story must be started from the beginning. In the old days there were no adequate means of refrigeration, so people tended to eat animals in stages. Between stages they left the animal alive so the organs eaten were always fresh. This phenomenon caused great sorrow to the animals who lived a borrowed life for a certain period until they died. During this period of their lives, they suffered severely from injuries caused by the cutting off of their limbs by the people who gradually consumed them. Basically, if we look at the Hebrew Bible, we find at the beginning of the days of the first man, God did not allow humans to eat animals but only plants. As it is written in the book of Genesis, chapter 1, verse 29, God clearly instructs man to eat only the fruits of the earth. Also in chapter 2 verse 16, God places Adam in the Garden of Eden and instructs him to eat only the fruit of the trees of the Garden of Eden. In addition, in the 3rd chapter in verses 18, 19, God guides man towards his food regime. When he presents the work of the land from which from the day of the expulsion onwards a person will eat. Chapter 4 also shows us Cain working the land and Abel who was a shepherd. When the two present an offering to God, Cain gives the fruit of the land while Abel brings milk and cheeses. Again, there is no mention of meat foods whatsoever. In fact, the original divine command was to eat only plants and not to eat animals. The question arises, when did humans start eating animals? The answer is after the flood. God allows Noah and his sons to start eating animals as well. In the book of Genesis, chapter 9, verse 3, it is clearly stated that it is permissible to eat any living thing in addition to plants, but God warns in the next verse, not to eat a living thing with its soul and blood. Furthermore, God emphasizes in the next verse, verse 5, the punishment he imposes on shedding blood. That is, there is a severe prohibition on people who cause injustice to others, whether they are humans or animals. It should be noted from now on, in the entire Hebrew Bible, that God places special emphasis on the issue of blood. For example, the divine commandment, blood is the soul, is stated in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 12, verse 23. The Israelites are required, after the slaughter, to cover the blood of the animals consumed by them. As mentioned, when humans began to eat animals as well, a new need arose, to preserve the meat. While it was fresh, preservatives were needed for this. However, in previous periods, natural preservatives such as salt and sugar were not abundant. Salt was a very expensive commodity. The proof that the word for salary in Latin is salt, from which the word is transferred to all languages related to Latin. This is because the Roman soldiers would receive their salary in two forms, silver coins and/or blocks of salt, which they would exchange for trade. Besides salt, the other natural preservative was sugar, which was a valuable commodity. In principle, these two preservatives, salt and sugar, needed to be produced in a complex process that only in later times managed to make this process cheaper. Until then, salt was mined in the salt mountains and transported to the consumption areas, which results in a significant increase in the cost of salt to the consumer. As mentioned, when there are no adequate cooling means, the meat would spoil and the consumers would have to throw it away. Because of this reason, for example, in the Passover sacrifice in the book of Exodus, God commands each family to take a lamb for the sake of the sacrifice. However, if the family is too small to consume one whole lamb, there is an instruction to connect with the neighbors so that there is not too much meat left over. since we have two instructions here. The first is not to leave anything from the Passover sacrifice, and the second instruction, if there is any left over, the remains must be burned in fire. In the education book, which was written from traditions that existed in the Jewish world, it is said that the purpose of this instruction, this mitzvah, is to avoid cruelty. That is, to leave the animal suffering until its final death for the sake of the desire to eat fresh meat without the need to throw away and waste expensive meat. Apart from the issue of cruelty, the most striking thing about this practice is the transformation of the practice into a kind of animal of prey. Most prey animals eat their prey while it is still alive. Sometimes several lions slowly chew the flesh of a wild boar placed in front of them as it moans and cries in pain while they enjoy their meal. Such a form of behavior in humans necessarily makes them cruel and inconsiderate of others, whether they are human and/or animal. In addition to that, the reference of that person to the animal instead of as a living being but as a block or group of organs, which contradicts the meaning of creation itself. Especially when we know that both man and beast were created by the same God, and what man is allowed from beast is the divine command as expressed in the book of Genesis, chapter 1, verse 28. It is God's permission for humans to rule over the animal kingdom. Without this commandment, there is really no difference between life and man. If we refer to this prohibition, logically, we will find it very logical, since it is known that when an animal is slaughtered, the animal secretes in its body, like any living creature in danger, adrenaline. When a person eats fresh meat that has just been slaughtered, this adrenaline enters the consumer's body and may cause him certain health damages. To prevent this, fresh meat is aged and not consumed immediately after slaughter. Aging the meat for several weeks allows the adrenaline to dissipate and the meat becomes safer for consumption. But this is not the case when the animal is left alive and only from time to time a limb or piece is cut off. In such a case, the animal is in a state of constant secretion of adrenaline. Thus, the consumer actually consumes along with the meat also immeasurable amounts of adrenaline, which may eventually cause him some health damage whether in the short term and/or in the long term. Hence, this prohibition can even be seen as a prohibition that comes to protect the health of the meat consumer, in that through this prohibition he avoids health damage resulting from this cruel method of consumption. Another thing, the matter of impurity. Impurity is a great weight in the relationship between man and his God. In Judaism there is a significant emphasis on the issue of impure versus pure. The prohibition of the people to be involved in impure things came to emphasize mainly the pure. As we know, the sensory perception of humans is usually dichotomous. That is, we recognize something because of its opposite. For example, we know that it is night because we know the concept of day. When we recognize something, it will usually be contrasted with the thing that contradicts it. This perception is important in order to understand and enhance our personal knowledge of the perception of the world around us. What are things supposed to be? When, for example, we consume meat. In the limb-by-limb method, when the animal is still alive, we create a system of great impurity. To cut a limb from the animal, we will have to do it near the house. Otherwise, what's the point if the animal is somewhere else? Another person can consume it without the knowledge of the original consumer. When you cut a living thing, it bleeds and the blood brings with it all kinds of flying insects that live on that blood. These flying insects are not satisfied with what the area next to the injured animal offers them. They fly all over the area and cause a significant decrease in the quality of life of the residents of the house. Meanwhile, the wound that does not heal over time, because the consumer comes back and cuts again to continue consuming the meat begins to rot and get necrotic as a result of not healing the cut place. Beyond that, this meat is consumed by the consumer who does not want to part with the wounded animal. Along with it can happen that the animal dies from its wounds and the consumer arrives and sees the animal dead. In this case the meat is no longer fresh and he eats carrion. And he paid for his loss while basing himself in impurity and a significant lack of health. Despite the above, the more important point is the animal itself. The fact that we consume the flesh of the animal for our pleasure does not allow us the right to abuse it. The Torah is full of instructions aimed at alleviating the suffering of animals. The right of animals to a life as fair as possible is a right that should not be taken away because of the whim of man. Hence, killing animals for pleasure and not for consumption is a cruel act like no other. The Torah warns us against such behavior and allows the animal laws that protect it from us. Below is an example that emphasizes the spirit of the Torah. In the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 9, verse 4, it is said, "Shall not muzzle the ox when he treadeth out the corn." This important instruction stems from the Torah's consideration of animals. When an ox or any other domestic animal is working in a threshing floor of grain, for which it is food, this animal should not be stopped when it stops its work in order to eat from the food that is abundantly placed in front of it. Not allowing an animal to enjoy the food placed before it constitutes significant cruelty in God's eyes. This cruelty is unnecessary and therefore it prevents the true closeness of man to his God. It indicates a quality of man who was created in the image of God. If God is merciful, man must be no less merciful. Mercy towards the helpless is an indication of the spiritual superiority of the merciful. This important instruction of not eating a limb of an animal while it is alive is a significant touchstone for the person who is looking for meaning in his relationship with God. When a person has mercy on the innocent and has mercy on the helpless, such as animals, widows, orphans and the poor, something that the Torah commands us to do over and over again, that person actually becomes a truly good person. A good person is a social concept that is expressed in values and cultural norms, but these norms and values are not instructions from heaven. Rather, habits that suit the way of life of people in a given place. To this end, the Torah actually tries to instill more universal values that will suit people in any situation. The relation to goodness is well expressed in the relation we have to animals. What differentiates man from animal is that man also kills for pleasure. The animal kills only for food, but the animal eats while the food is still alive, and therefore a human being who eats like an animal becomes worse than an animal, since he also kills for pleasure and not because of the need to eat, and also eats cruelly. Therefore, in order to be a good person, a person must have a different way of eating than the animals.